Assalamualaikum. How's everybody doing? Hopefully good. I know some people might be on mute. Or most people
doing well.
I like the emoji reactions. That's good. I like getting some feedback when I'm giving my talks. Belated Ramadan Mubarak to everybody. I hope this month has been what you hoped it was, and if it's not, I pray that inshallah that this Ramadan is, you see it as exactly what Allah wanted for you, and you are pleased with the divine decree of what it's been unfolding and how it's been unfolding for you. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي امري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لمن سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي الى صراط المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره ومقداره العظيم. So I wanted to talk about Ramadan, obviously, because we're in Ramadan. We're about halfway through already. In the chat, really quick, give me one word or a couple of words about how your Ramadan is going so far. Just curious to hear. Too fast. Yeah. Yeah, I can't believe we're like halfway through already. Lonely. Yeah. Especially like we're just starting to really come out of the pandemic. So people are kind of still winded, I think, from the pandemic, and all the gatherings that we just did so quickly and easily that we've done our whole lives have been kind of paused. So it's hard to like just go back to normal again, so I feel that. Anybody else want to say in the chat how their Ramadan is going in one word or just a couple of words? Peaceful. That's good. I'm glad to hear that. Well, whether it's going well or not well is completely relative. And that's something that I really want to remind everybody of, that our ideas and conceptions as finite beings about what is good and bad for us is completely irrelevant in the context of divine knowledge, in the context of the infinite being knowing what's best for us, right? Someone else has just shared. A little bit sad because of all the issues that's happening around the world. Absolutely. Yeah. Sometimes I wonder, like, is the world actually getting worse, or is it that we're more hyper connected than we ever have been to the world and its suffering that makes us feel it more? But either way, keep all of these people in your dua, all of these nations that are suffering in your dua this month. But on that note, in the context of divine knowledge, it's really hard to kind of understand and contextualize our own hardships and the hardships of others. And I'm not saying that I have answers for why people suffer at all, and I don't, I'm not going to try and pretend like I have the reasons, but I do know one thing, which is that when Allah created Adam, which is mankind, the angels were like, they called it right away. And I had mentioned this in previous talks before. The angels were like, why would you create a being that's going to cause destruction on earth? They knew up front that the reality of the design of humankind is that we are fallible. That's a design, that's a feature of the design, not a bug. So, and then Allah only responds to them, I know that which you do not know. And I remember reading that and being like, oh, come on, give me more than just that, because I like trying to make sense of so much of the hardship in my own life and in other people's lives has been a part of my, spiritual journey. And I think it should be for everybody's, is like witnessing how Allah has created the world and what the kind of power that Allah gave us, which is free will. right? And that's kind of basically what's causing all this, these issues, you know, in the world, is that we've been given this great power to cause either peace to each other or great suffering to each other, right? And part of that free will is like the reason why it's such a like a powerful thing is that it makes our love and our turning towards Allah that much more meaningful because we're choosing it. We weren't forced into it, right? But choice is as a responsibility. And to quote Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. And the power of choice that we have to turn towards Allah has some serious connotations with that, right? Which is why we have to constantly turn towards Allah and ask Allah to guide us towards righteousness, because ultimately righteousness in the world, in the context of our free will and the way we think, is entirely subjective. Righteousness is entirely subjective. At one point in American history, slavery was considered a normal thing. It was not considered morally abhorrent, was it? So we can't really trust ourselves to define morality, right? We have to trust the expert, and the expert being Allah. And then the question goes on, which is like, okay, what is Allah saying to us? Who speaks on behalf of Allah? All those questions are very good questions, and that's part of the journey, the journeying towards Allah. But today, I want to talk about one part of that journey, which is Ramadan. And one thing that really stood out to me, I feel like Allah was telling me, like I couldn't fast the first 2 days of Ramadan for health reasons. And I was really frustrated. I was like, I was like scrolling through Instagram, just like being mindless. And I was like, I wish I could just fast. This is so frustrating. And immediately when I had that thought, I scrolled to a post by Dr. Bilal where he wrote, fasting is more than just the abstinence of food and drink. And Ramadan is so much more than that. And I was like, oh yeah, thanks Allah. Thank you for sending me a message through Dr. Bilal where may Allah bless him and his family. And I want to start off by talking about the abstinence of the food and drink, and then going on further into why it's not just about the food and drink. Yeah. Bismillah. So when we withhold from food and drink, it's not just about hunger and thirst. And I think it's a hadith. It would be really good if I had pulled this up, but I'm going to butcher it. But paraphrasing from this hadith is that Rasulullah says that some people experience all of Ramadan and all they have experienced is hunger and thirst. That some people go through all of Ramadan and all they experience is hunger and thirst. And what that's saying is that wasn't the point. The point isn't just hunger and thirst, right? And the way I have understood Ramadan and fasting and what that means, like why does Allah command us to withhold from food, drink, and sexual activity from sunup to sundown every single day? The reality is that who are we, right? Like the reality is who we are, and who we are is not our bodies. So when for those who aren't aware, in Islamic tradition, we've been taught that all of our souls existed in pre-eternality, in the realm of souls, al-alam al-arwah, in the barzakh. And we all bore witness and testified to God's oneness. And then God took our souls, these beautiful, I don't even know, these beautiful things, right? Our souls, which is who we are essentially. That God breathed life into us with the divine breath, and took those souls and put them inside of our nefs. Nefs, N-A-F-S. Nefs means, like, a general kind of a loose translation is like ego. And so our souls were placed into our egos, and our egos were placed into our physical bodies. And we've manifested in the dunya here, the material world, the realm of the material, quote unquote, when everything is material, really. And in the dunya, when our souls were put into our nefs and we're born, you know, some scholars say that when we're born and we cry, it's because babies cry because they're experiencing separation from the divine. because they're now in their nafs, in their body, in the dunya. Which, I mean, I think that's very fascinating and a huge potential of like, that makes sense. If we are lovers of Allah, to be separated by, we're not actually physically being separated from Allah, but anything that we're being veiled from Allah is really a sign to get to Allah. So our nafs is something that is now like, we have this obstacle, this veil that is part of us that we have to transcend. So our whole job essentially as Muslims is to battle this nafs, this ego, to become aware of this nafs, this ego, overcome it and realize and recognize and remember who we were, who we are truly right now, despite being in the dunya, that we are souls and that we existed before all of this in harmony, in transcendence with God. So when we abstain from food and drink, it's a reminder that we are human beings. We're not human beings having a spiritual experience. We're spiritual beings having a human experience. I'm sure some of you have seen this quote before, which I'll repeat for those who haven't heard it before. We are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. Meaning what? That we are souls, essentially. We are spiritual beings before we are human beings. And the thing about the physical body is it's an animal. We are animals, we're mammals, right? Essentially, according to how we've studied, human beings and animals and everything like that, right? Why? Because we behave in a lot of ways similarly to animals, meaning we reproduce, we need to eat, we need to drink, we need to breathe. There are certain things that if we don't have, we'll die, right? We're finite beings. We deteriorate, we age, we get sick. And this animal part of us is still very sacred and important. But we also have to recognize that that's not who we are, because we are not fundamentally what separates us from animals. There's a few different opinions about what makes us different from animals. But one of the main things is the ability to use reason and transcend our physical bodies into the spirit. And one of the ways in which we do that as Muslims is abstaining from the animal instincts and urges that we have for our survival, which is food, water, and sexual activity. So if we're abstaining from these things that we are evolutionarily wired for our survival to do these things, we have to for survival. But the fact that, tell me any animal that will willingly abstain from food, drink, and reproduction for the sake of God, right? That's what makes us different, because ultimately we're not animals, we're spiritual beings. And Ramadan is a reminder of that through the conscious abstaining of these things that keep us alive, right? So just looking at my notes here. So when we are abstaining from food and drink and reproductive urges, we're remembering and we're becoming conscious of our nafs, of our egos. Because for a lot of people, it's really hard to be hungry. Some people, they're just chilling when they're fasting. They'll feel maybe a little bit of hunger and thirst, but they're kind of the same person. They don't get hangry. We envy those people. Mashallah, may Allah bless them. But for a lot of us, when you abstain from food and drink, you get tired. You might get cranky, like hangry. You might feel just your capacity to move at the speed that you're usually going at is much slower. Even if fasting isn't as difficult for you in terms of the draining aspect of it that happens to a lot of people, for others, it slows them down. And I invite everybody who is able to fast to become consciously aware every time they feel a hunger pang in their stomach, anytime they feel a sense of thirst, to be aware that's oh, I am not my body, because my body's asking me for something and I'm saying no. So who is me and who is my body? Who is the body actually consulting? Because we are proving to ourselves in that moment that the body doesn't run the show. The ruh does, the soul runs the show. And that reminds us of who we are essentially. But sometimes our nafs is running the show. So how do we fast? So we reminded ourselves through fasting and abstaining from the food of our bodies that our bodies are not running the show, but sometimes our egos are running the show, right? And we know it's not shaitan, because shaitan obviously has influence over our behavior, right? I would say that shaitan is a logician and a philosopher. Shaitan likes to play with truth and bend it. But then our egos hear it out and run with it. And this is the way I define our egos, like our nafs. Our nafs has a propensity for two things. Its main two things is this: to seek pleasure and comfort, and to avoid pain and discomfort. So our nafs is always getting us to do two things: to seek pleasure and comfort, and to avoid pain and discomfort at any cost, whether it's ethical, moral, or not. And so we're often, this is why it's called Jihad and Nephs. There's often this back and forth, this kind of fight that's kind of happening within you to seek out the comfort, but at what cost? To avoid the discomfort, but at what cost? And when I say Jihad and Nefs, that translates to the struggle of the self. The Rasul has a hadith where him and his companions were coming back from a defensive battle that was really, really arduous and difficult. And the Prophet said, now we go to the harder, the greater jihad. Jihad translates to struggle. And the Prophet they're coming home from battle. And he says, now we go to the greater jihad, the jihad of the self. Because it's so much more difficult to overcome yourself and your instincts to avoid discomfort and seek comfort. Because the reality is, growth oftentimes requires some discomfort. And this is how we do it. So we start by doing something really uncomfortable, which is abstaining from food and drink, so that we can bring awareness to who we truly are, which is we're spiritual beings. And during this hyper awareness of the fact that we are spiritual beings, we are not our bodies, our nefs, our egos start to come up. And this is why, even if you're not able to fast, right? Like pregnant folks, new moms, the elderly, the ill, are not able to fast, but your nefs is still very much there that you need to fast from. So how do we fast from our nefs? First and foremost is you become aware, right? You become aware of all of the ways that your ego starts to get in the way of, you doing the right thing. And what is the right thing? It's the thing that you have learned about what God has commanded you to do about righteousness. And it's what you know in your heart is the right thing, because your soul has a deep knowing about what is righteous and what is good. But sometimes a cognitive dissonance arises where the thing that is good for you clashes with the thing that is comfortable for you. When you know that something is good for you and it clashes with the thing that's comfortable for you, that is when you need to confront and be aware that, okay, this is my nafs. Am I going to choose the thing that is good, even if it doesn't feel good? And in the Quran, Allah says, perhaps you hate a thing and it's good for you, and perhaps you love a thing and it's bad for you. Well, Allah knows and you do not. And one such example is fasting itself. So science is just starting to catch up with the immense benefits of fasting and what that can do for the body. So I highly recommend people to look into the phenomenon called, what's it called? What was it called? It's a phenomenon where when you fast, your body actually recycles old cells and free radicals and converts it into energy. And that's the only way the body actually ever uses those old cells is if you abstain from food and drink. I can't remember the word, but I highly recommend that you look into the just the science behind what happens when you fast, and how those old cells that normally, if they're not burned and used into converted into energy, they sit and become free radicals and can eventually turn cancerous. So subhanAllah, like we had no idea about this, and science is just starting to confirm things that Allah has assigned to us. But I think this is a mercy from Allah that we are starting to learn why it's so good for us. It's a mercy because Allah is like, hey, trust me, here's some science. If that's what you see as like the pinnacle of truth, here you go. Here's science to confirm what I'm telling you. But 1400 years ago, they didn't have the kind of, science and tools and methodologies to study how to even like see and witness like things like old cells being recycled, right? They didn't have that context. But what did they do? They trusted the expert with a capital E. So I always say this, trust the expert. Just like how, and this is general, obviously there's always going to be exceptions to any rule, but just take this example as I go. Most of us, when we go to a mechanic, we'll go to the mechanic when we don't know what's going on with our car, and the mechanic might recommend something, and it's all like Chinese or Greek to us. We have no idea what the mechanic is saying. And he might be like, oh, this axle combustion, whatever. Clearly, I don't know nothing about cars. Needs to be fixed, and it's going to cost you $700. And you're like, what? No. And then you might go to like 3 other mechanics, and if they all say the same thing, you're not going to go and study the car yourself and get a degree in mechanic engineering or whatever to arrive to a conclusion. You're going to trust the experts, essentially, right? And in a way, there's a kind of leap of faith that comes with that, even if you get multiple opinions about this. Same with like doctors. If a doctor, and again, this is a general rule of thumb, the doctor says we need to remove one of your organs or else you'll die. You might get other opinions, but ultimately the idea of like, and sorry to be graphic, but the idea of like cutting open your body and removing an organ feels like it's the worst thing for you. Like the idea of doing that seems like that's not health. That feels like insanity. If we think about it just in those terms, like cutting yourself open and removing an organ sounds like insanity. But if a doctor, and doctors generally say that this is a consensus for your survival, you will trust the expert. Like, okay, do this thing for me that seems like it's really bad for me, because I trust you, because you know that which I do not know. And similarly, Allah is the expert of all experts. Allah knows things that we just will never know. So fasting, the fact that we are just like starting to receive the science behind why fasting is beneficial, is a mercy from Allah, is a reassurance from Allah, like trust the expert, right? And this is also what happens when we're confronting our nafs. Our nafs craves these things like comfort and avoidance of pain because it's rooted in a type of almost fear. We're almost like allergic and averse to like discomfort and pain, because we can't, when we are in discomfort and pain, we can't let go and just trust that this is good for us. We kind of tense up, we brace ourselves. And not to say that you should just never feel pain or discomfort, but don't run away from it. Right? And that is the point, that is the purpose of our nafs, is a reminder that we need God. The whole purpose of our nafs is there as an ayah, which translates to sign of God. And oftentimes we might see like the nafs as like, when we do recognize, oh, like our nafs is running the show here, and then we do something that we're not ashamed of, that we're not proud of, that we feel ashamed of, you might become aware of your nafs and go, oh, it's Ramadan and my nafs is still like, it's not shaitan, it's me, it's my nafs. I can't believe that. And that feels so, and I've had so many people talk to me about this, like, I can't believe I'm getting angry in the holiest month of the year. I can't believe I shouted at someone. I can't believe I, whatever. The list goes on and on. I'm sure all of you can think of something during this Ramadan that you're not proud of, right? But my mentor taught me this. May Allah bless him. His name is Mohammed Dominguez. He's the drummer of Al Firdaus Ensemble, which is a beautiful group. You should check them out. Shout out to them. He has taught me that your nefs, when you become aware of your nefs, aware of the thing that you've done wrong, it's actually not a cause, it's not a cause for shame, it's a cause for celebration. Why? Because that means your soul is starting to become aware of who it is, because you are not your nefs. He said, don't identify with your nefs. That's not who you are. Your nefs is the thing that Allah gave you as a tribulation to remind you of your need for Him. And it's the thing that will bring you closer to Him through this kind of, this awareness, this consulting, this turning back. Like I mentioned in other talks before, our entire purpose is to turn back to Allah. That's what tawbah actually translates to. Tawbah, which we roughly usually translate as forgiveness or seeking forgiveness, actually means turning back to Allah. And a reminder again of something that I've mentioned in previous talks is like when Adam was created and him and Hawa were created, and Allah told them not to eat from the tree, they made a mistake by listening to shaitan and eating from the tree. But it wasn't a punishment that they were brought to the dunya. And this is something that a lot of people tend to get wrong because they follow narratives of other faith traditions. But in our faith tradition, what happens after they eat from the tree, directly after in the Quran, the next ayah is, and I turned Adam towards me and taught him the words of tawbah. I taught him the words of seeking forgiveness, of turning back. And then I forgave him. And then I said, go to earth. So what does that tell us? That whole situation was not a punishment. That whole situation was a divine practice session of what we're meant to do on earth over and over and over again until we die. Because the idea is that we start off small. We start off with, we're just one big nefs when we're babies, right? Children, all they do is cry when they're in discomfort and seek out pleasure or comfort, right? But as you grow and mature, and you can see when someone is really, really mature, when you meet someone who seems very wise, seems to have a very good hold on themselves and reality and people around them, right? Because they have worked on themselves. There's like a type of, it's called tarbiyah, which is like a type of like raising yourself, growing, and attaining transcendence over time. And that happens through the nefs. And the nefs is there as a reminder, almost like a teacher, really. So when you recognize your nefs, be happy because, that means that the soul is alive. The soul is aware. The soul is recognizing, this is not who I am. Now, when you have that realization, this is not who I am, what do? Because sometimes the nefs doesn't like to be called out, right? Sometimes your nefs will be like, are you going to try and make me get rid of autophagy? Thank you, Rashnara. That's how you pronounce it. Autophagy is the, sorry, my phone alarm is going off. Autophagy is the word that I think everyone should look up about. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly because I've only read it in research, but that's the process in which your body recycles old cells. Anyway, as I was saying, so what happens when the nefs has been called out by the soul? Firstly, the soul, you need to make sure that you're not being harsh to the nefs in this way of like shaming. So, and I talked about this in other talks as well, but this is also relevant for Ramadan. Shame versus guilt. There's a huge difference between the two. And we have to be really diligent and remembering the difference between the two, because one of them is healthy and one of them is unhealthy. Guilt is a healthy emotion that's associated with growing, taking action to rectify yourself. Guilt means I did something bad, right? I did something bad. Shame, behavioral scientists have correlated research, behavioral scientists research that shame is associated directly with things like addiction, depression, poor interrelationship dynamics, because shame is defined as I am bad. So guilt is defined as I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. Now, can you recognize why one is healthy and one isn't? If you see yourself as bad, that means you see yourself as incorrigible, which means like you're beyond help. Like, this is who I am. I'm defined as this thing and there's no changing it. And sometimes that shame gets it's so heavy to hold that people will do anything they can to run away from it, including taking responsibility for their wrongdoings, for their shortcomings, because they worry that if they admit to that thing that they did that was wrong, that means they're admitting to being a terrible human being. But that's not the case, because you are not your nefs. You're not defined by those wrongdoings. You're defined by the tawbah process, that divine practice session that Allah did with Adam. Like, hey, you messed up you used your free will in a way to mess up. That's part of the process. Just turn back, right? And there's a hadith, Qudsi, that says if, and again, I'm paraphrasing, but if there was ever a person that did not sin and then make tawbah and return to God and seek forgiveness, I would destroy him and replace him with a being who sinned and made tawbah and returned back to God. Because that's how we're designed. Because if we didn't sin, we would be angels, right? We wouldn't have free will. The angels don't have free will. They just worship and glorify God and listen to God's commandments, right? So how do we go about overcoming our nefs and fasting from our nefs, right? It's through awareness. So one of the things that fasting actually allows you to do is you become more hypersensitive to the world, in the sense of through your physical senses. You know, when you eat that first date, when you break your fast, it's like, if you like dates, it's like the best date you've ever had versus just having a date on a full stomach, right? You're like, you barely even taste it anymore. So there's something about, and you know, my husband always talks about this hypersensitivity that Islam really encourages in a lot of different ways through the Sharia. And one of those ways of hypersensitivity is through fasting. And the reason it's really important to have your like hypersensitivity and like a heightened sense of the world is because the opposite of hypersensitivity is desensitization, meaning you're not really present or feeling anything anymore. So the reason we fast isn't because we're just going up against our bodies, but because we use our bodies to worship, right? But it's to recognize that our bodies are vehicles to get to Allah. And if we become desensitized from our bodies entirely, we might become desensitized to our spirits as well. And so that leads me to go back to the body itself. Some bodies are not able to fast. They're not able to abstain from food and drink. But that is okay, because the reality is those who are not able to fast are probably experiencing some kind of hardship or tribulation. And you have to trust the expert that this hardship or tribulation has the capacity to allow you to transcend. That hardship and tribulation can give you a framework that forces you to see things in ways that you never would have seen otherwise, whatever it may be. So when we get hardship in our lives, it's not because God's trying to punish you. And subhanAllah, like one of my teachers told me that a hardship is only a punishment if you use that hardship to distance yourself from Allah. That a hardship is only a punishment if you're using that hardship to distance yourself from God. Because the reality is, again, you have free will. You have the choice to utilize your hardship to try and grow beyond yourself in ways that you couldn't even imagine. Or you can use that hardship and stay stagnant where you are, or choose to be bitter or choose to wrong other people because you've been wronged, right? We all have that choice. So the way I frame it is hardship is essentially an opportunity. And not to say that it's, and like some people have hardships happen in their life and it's not because they deserve it. None of us deserve some of the things that happen to us, but they're opportunities. And not just for the individual, they're opportunities for everybody. When we see someone else in hardship, that is an opportunity for us to turn towards them and help and assist them. Again, free will keeps coming back to this. Like, the reason people hurt each other is because of free will. And the reason people help each other is because of free will. And it's really important to remember, like, when you're in hardship in Ramadan, it's like difficult. Like, a lot of people say, oh, Ramadan is so nice, I love it, I wouldn't want this month to be over. Or like, a couple months they'll be like, I can't wait for Ramadan. And it's beautiful when people feel that way. But I can see other people, I've talked about people who, like, they roll their eyes, they're like, I'm not ready to fast, it's so hard for me to fast, I'm miserable when I fast, and they feel a sense of maybe like, envy, like, it's not fair, like, I don't feel that way. And what our shame can make us start to believe is like, oh, it's clearly because I'm not a good person. That's why Ramadan is hard for me. That's why I don't really enjoy Ramadan. I don't enjoy fasting. It must be because I'm a bad person or a bad Muslim. That's your shame talking. You did nothing wrong. You did nothing wrong by struggling with your fast. If anything, you're doing something extremely beautiful. And the weight of the action that you are going through, that you're doing for Allah, is measured by how much you had to struggle for it. Like, Allah sees the struggle. So someone who might not really feel that much hunger during Ramadan, are they gaining the same spiritual benefit that you are? Only Allah knows that, right? But just what we know about each other and what we know about love, the more someone who loves us struggles for our sake, the more that love feels so much more sincere to us, doesn't it? Which is why free will is a testament to our love to Allah. Free will is the ultimate test of love. Or is it just, hey, you didn't tell me when your birthday was or whatever, or I remembered when you mentioned your birthday and I got you this gift. You didn't ask me. That's so much more sincere, isn't it? So much more loving. And this is the context with which we learn about divine love. So the abstinence of food and drink, as well as being like a reminder that we're spiritual beings, is also an act of love. It's an act of love because it's like, I love this thing. And when some people are not foodies, right? They don't love to eat like some others, but you still love food in the sense of you need it. You need it to survive, right? So you're saying to Allah, I love this thing so much and it's necessary to my survival, and it feels deeply uncomfortable to go without it for several hours a day. But I love you even more than that, enough to put myself through this for you, for the sake of your love. And it's a beautiful testament of love. And again, if you're someone who is unable to fast, overcoming your nafs is still a huge homework assignment for all of us to do, right? And for new mothers, you're not just abstain, you're not able to abstain from food and drink, but guess what? You're abstaining from sleep. You're abstaining from your daily comforts. You're abstaining from a type of freedom of where you could just go to the store or go to see a friend and not have anything holding you back, right? So you're absolutely abstaining from something, but it's not necessarily food and drink. And same with the ill or the elderly. Maybe you're not abstaining from food and drink, but you're abstaining from your like the physical capabilities that most people enjoy the privilege of. And you're not just fasting that during Ramadan, you're fasting it for however long the illness or whatever it is that you're experiencing lasts, which is unbelievable. It's beautiful. It has a capacity to be a very beautiful experience. And it's not to say or diminish the tribulation that comes with that, because there's no spiritual bypassing here. What you're experiencing is difficult, absolutely difficult. But like I always say, when you're in tribulation, you have to remember that it's Allah is showing you Jalal, through the tribulation. And Jalal, it translates roughly to like majesty, like the kind of like awesome power that God has that can kind of be a little terrifying, right? That's the Jalal of Allah. But Allah is not only Jalal, Allah is also Jamal. Jamal translates roughly to like beauty and ease. So God is both the comfort and the discomfort. God is the constriction and expansion. Within every constriction, there is nuggets of expansion. Within every expansion, there's nuggets of constriction. It's very, yin and yang, as we have seen. I don't know if anyone has seen that symbol, right? But for those who are not familiar with the Taoist philosophy about the yin and yang symbol, it's the black and white circle, where there's like a little white dot within the black part and a little black dot within the white part, is to say that within every bad, there is some good, and with every good, there is some bad. So this is not like a new kind of understanding of our world, right? And the key is, I went through something very difficult about a month ago, and my mentor told me, whenever you're experiencing the Jalal of Allah, you have to make tawbah. And I was like, tawbah, why? Like, seek forgiveness. What did I do wrong, right? And he said, it's not about wrongdoing. Tawbah means turning back. So when you are experiencing Jalal, like the majesty of God, you need to return to God in the holistic nature of God, which is the Jamal as well. You cannot have one without the other. So often we get lost in the news about all the Jalal that's happening in this world. And my mentor told me, at any given moment that someone is experiencing immense tribulation, in that same exact moment, there is a baby nursing its mother experiencing extreme bliss. There is both. You have to have both. You cannot be truthful, and you cannot fully witness God in this world without having both. And I think we are kind of, I read an article once that we are evolved as human beings. Our brains are wired to remember the bad more than the good, because that ensured our survival as a species, that we have to be hyper aware of danger so that we can avoid it and continue to survive as a species. So it's really an active type of fasting, because we're going against our animal instinct to just hyperfixate on danger. Again, that's our animal self hyperfixating on danger and negative news. That's why the news is always mostly negative. What really gets the views, what gets the clicks, what gets the witnessing is the bad news. But we're not being honest if we're saying that's the only news available. We're not truly being honest with the reality of what Allah is doing at any given moment. Because sometimes we're watching the experience of someone's pain, and we just can't quantify what that feels like. But similarly so, some people are doing such incredible, beautiful things that we can't quantify what that feels like for others too. Someone once said to me, always look for the helpers. There's always helpers. So in the midst of what they mean is, like, in the midst of the Jalal, where a great tribulation is happening to a people, when you zoom in, you will see acts of incredible heroism, incredible determination, incredible love, incredible commitment to humankind. There is both. Because if we fixate on the Jalal, the majesty part, we're not seeing Allah holistically, and we will get lost in despair. And in our tradition, they say that despair is the way of shaitan. Despair is the way of shaitan, because if you don't have hope, if you don't remember that this world is temporal, it's temporary, then of course you're going to be in despair, and it'll be so much harder to serve. You won't feel like serving, because you'll be like, what's the point? Like, is it really making a difference? And there's a story where there's a bunch of starfish on the shore, and this little boy is taking each starfish on the shore and throwing them back into the ocean. And a man comes up to the boy and he says, what difference is this going to make to these starfish? There's so many of them. And the boy picks up a starfish, throws it into the ocean. He said, it made a difference to that one. So if human life is as precious as we say it is, then we can't turn away from moments in which human life is flourishing. It's just as important as when human life is not flourishing. So what does this have to do with Ramadan, right? Is awareness of our physical human limitations, essentially, because our human physical limitations make us, like it's called lizard brain, what they say in psychology. Lizard brain is like your animal brain, which is wired to see danger, wired to seek out comfort, wired to seek out pleasure. And during Ramadan, God is like, let's put that on hold for now and remember who we truly are, that we are spiritual beings having a human experience. And just to recap, because I think we are running out of time, we're like 10 minutes. And I want to have some time for Q&A. If you start witnessing and realizing who your nefs is, that your nefs will have that much less power over you. And the way you're able to start becoming more aware of your nefs is through worship. Remember your dhikr, remember your salah, these things that God prescribed to us as obligatory, which is like fasting, prayer. These things are the way that, like, they're prescribed to us because they're good for us. Not because Allah doesn't need us to worship him. He's Allah. He's the greatest divine infinite being there is. Like, it does nothing for him for us to worship him, right? There's no like, okay, Allah, I'll give you this if you give me that. I'm going to pray for this thing that I really want and I'll worship you so you can give it to me. No, there's none of that transactional stuff. It's good for us. It's simply good for us to worship. Because if you stay in your nefs, if you stay running away from discomfort, you will not grow. You will not transcend. You will not love fully the way you are capable of loving fully. You will not be soaked with relationships that truly nourish you. You will be in despair, in despair, in despair. So Allah's like, come to me. And Rumi says, come, whoever you are. Our caravan is not that of despair. So remember your worship. Remember that when you are worshiping Allah, even if you don't feel it, this is a big one too. A lot of people say, like, I go through Ramadan and I don't really like, and I'm praying, but I don't like feel anything. That's not the point. That is not the point. Because if you're praying so you could feel something, that's your nefs being like, all right, fine. Like, I'll do this thing that's kind of uncomfortable. I'll get up in the middle of what I'm doing to go pray. But if I don't feel anything pleasurable, it's not worth it. Remember, rewind and be like, okay, this is about my soul. It's not about my nefs. So if you don't feel it, it doesn't matter. There is a purification. Trust that there is a purification spiritually happening for you to be returning to Allah. That you are literally actively connecting with God in this moment, even if you don't feel it. Your limbs are feeling it. They say that it's a right of your limbs to pray, of your body to pray. And yeah, that's my talk. I see someone who wrote something here in the chat. Great perspective on the philosophy behind fasting during the holy month of Ramadan, which includes suppressing nafs desires for the sake of Allah. Jazakallah khair. Well, yeah, Muhammad, thank you. If anybody has any questions, we do have 10 minutes until we depart.
Salam, Yasmeen, thank you so much for that reminder. I really loved what you said about
any questions. Yeah, thank you, Hannah. Yeah, and if nobody has any questions, if you do want to contact me, just contact someone at Muslim Space and they will give you my contact information, inshallah. Otherwise, let's close with a dua. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli wa sallam ala Sayyid Muhammad. Oh Allah, please allow this next half of Ramadan to be one in which we are more conscious and aware of ourselves, of our nafs and our souls. Oh Allah, allow this latter half of Ramadan to be one in which we are returning to you, turning back to you more frequently than we did in the first half of Ramadan. Oh Allah, allow us to remember that even if we're not feeling it, even if things don't feel good, to remember that these are opportunities for us to transcend. اللهم صل وسلم.